All right, so this is week number 6, actually lesson number 6. We've done a couple more weeks than that, so we've skipped some here and there. But this is halfway through Missional Essentials, and so what I really wanted to do this morning is just kind of discuss a little bit, because obviously the sneak preview of today, later, is I'm going to tell you that I fibbed a little bit, and that we're going to go into the next section of the New Old Vision, but due to some scheduling stuff and Easter coming up, we're going to take a deep breath and kind of let all that we've learned so far soak in, and then we're going to pick it up after Easter again, and we're going to talk about the kingdom of God in the meantime. So now we're kind of sort of at a halfway point, really, with Missional Essentials and with the New Old Vision. The first question I have, I want you to just discuss, and we can just kind of talk about it amongst ourselves right here. We don't need to whisper amongst yourselves. We can talk out loud here. How has God, over the last, basically we started this, I think, in January. How has God challenged you, and how has your outlook changed over the course of the New Old Vision, Missional Essentials, things of that nature?
I think it's just kind of opened my eyes a little more. It's changed the way that I look at things, look at them in a different light.
Can you give an example of a different way you look at things?
Not me saying.
Yeah? Good.
I'm more looking at, I find areas that I could do things. I don't always do them, but I'm starting to sometimes step out of that little box and do, come out of my comfort zone and talk to people, because before I wouldn't even, I might offend somebody, but now I just really don't care.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, is that I think the same thing has happened to me. And of course, before I'm able to teach and preach on this, it's something that I've had to live out in my own life. And I'm not saying that I've got it figured out or that I've reached the point of expertise in this, but it's something I've been struggling through for basically a couple of years now. And I've reached the same kind of point where all of a sudden you start seeing things differently. And the next step is, once you see things differently, then act differently and actually follow. Really, what I think is the Holy Spirit leading in that. I had a guy one time in a youth retreat said that we need to pay more attention to the spidey sense in our life. It's like the Holy Spirit. Spidey sense is like, whoa, 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 there's something going on, and that's kind of how the Holy Spirit works sometimes. Is all of a sudden it's like, ooh, I need to respond to this. So that's a very good answer, good point. How else, the rest of you, how has God challenged you? How has your outlook changed over the past couple months? Yeah, can I share just a little bit of your story? Yeah, I'm probably going to have Ellen share with the entire congregation at some point, trying to talk her into doing that. And she is basically, how long have you been taking this course that you've been doing? 8 or 9 weeks. 9 weeks, okay. She's been taking an art class, and basically she has engaged. If you remember back our let me see, I'll just write it up here. The cultural distance thing. Remember that from the class where we had the church here, and then M1 or 0, then 1, then 2, then 3, then 4. And now most of the time we interact with people that are kind of in the M1 section, or people who are into, or maybe have a church background. Ellen has come in contact with a lot of 3s and 4s, basically. In fact, is that a pretty accurate statement? Okay. People who are hostile to the faith, people who are, have preconceived notions about the church, who really don't want to have anything to do with Jesus or God, based on previous experiences and things of the like. And so Ellen is, in our discussion, I've talked to her a little bit. She's talked about in Bible class on Wednesday nights, that what some of those things that she's learned, she's seen the perspective of these people that, I think that you got to know the perspective of them. You got to know where they're coming from if you're going to reach them, if you're going to be able to share the kingdom with them. Ellen, what would you say would be like, if there was one big thing that you've learned, I hate to put you on the spot, but one big thing you learned when coming in contact with people, what would you say it was?
Just to be myself first, just get to know them as just me in their face about why we're looking at the conflict. And I've really learned that most of them, which surprises me, they just don't believe that there's a creator of any kind and everything they do is often inside of them. So it's kind of that idol of self-esteem, that it's all self-driven.
Yeah.
But then they'll turn around and say, "Oh, we're not going to do
And it's a very kind of spiritual group, though.
Yes, it is. But they think their spirituality is within that.
Mm-hmm.
That anything they create is not created within that. Not every one of them. There's a lot of wide range of degree, and then there's just a lot of new age, which I don't think is really new, it's just there's a lot of variations on the thing, but it's very anti-church, anti-Christian.
Mm-hmm.
That's the advantage. They really don't.
Yeah, they don't like us. Don't know us, but they don't like us. Yeah. And the truth of that is that if Ellen would have given them a tract or invited them to church the first time they met them, they would probably not ever talk to her again. And she's built some relationships with that. Talk to her, by the way, off the record a little bit and get her story. I think. Sorry to send everybody your way, Ellen, but it's a good story. What else? Yeah, Peggy.
I found that God goes before me.
Uh-huh.
That if I allow it, that He prepares before me.
Yeah.
And I think I always knew that, but I actually see it.
Yeah, if you can experience that truth, it makes it a lot, well, it makes things easier.
Yes.
It's that the concept of the Missio Dei is not something that is really brand new or something that we haven't understood, this idea that God goes ahead of us, but when you really experience it and see, okay, well, God is going to take care of me here. He's not going to leave me high and dry. And if He does, that means that I went before Him, and that's not what He intended either. Good, very good. Anything else? Yeah, Jamie.
For us, it's been generosity and learning. The more we give, the more God gives us to give, and the more that we find that He provides in ways that we never expect. And it's just that faith, putting your faith and trust in Him that, whatever happens, He's got this. And so it just frees us to take more action, to be more generous. So, we're by no means there, but at the same time, we feel like there's a lot of freedom in that.
Yeah.
And a lot less worry. Even when the budget's very, very tight, I don't worry like I used to.
Yeah.
Because I know God's taking care of it.
Yeah, I think on paper, these concepts and this life change is exhausting and it's scary because you think, how in the world can I live like that? But I think when we actually experience it, we find that it's renewing more than it is exhausting. Carolyn, yes?
I think for me, it's just being okay with myself that I can ask for help. That when I launch a project or something and I have something going even within my job, that I don't have to do it all. It's not about me. It's going to be for God's glory, and it's okay to make a few calls and say, hey, I need some help.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's one of the most relieving things that I came across is somebody said, it's not like I didn't know this, but somebody said in a sermon or a book I read or something that Jesus always sent people out, at least by two. When He sent people on mission, He always sent them. It was never just, you need to go here. And that was just kind of a really freeing kind of thing, both as myself, to think that I've had to do this myself, and this whole mantra of you need to go and share your faith with somebody, and it kind of is almost like that's what we've said to you as a church. You need to go to your friends, invite your friends to church, and tell them about Jesus. But the you is plural, and I think there's a lot of freedom in that to understand that this is we're not in this alone. And I think that's a great point. Yes, yeah, Bill.
Well, I don't want to put a damper on anything here, but when I look at that question that you got up there on the board, it hasn't changed a thing for me, not one. I mean, I'm still going out to prison. I share my faith with the guys that I work with. I mean, Todd's been on the job with me before. we went to blow down a high-pressure pipeline, I gathered everybody up and prayed for safety first, you know? So, it hasn't changed anything for me, not one iota. I'm still doing the same thing I've been doing for the last 18 years.
Well, and this is not against Bill, so don't think I'm being critical of Bill. I was going to say this anyway, but I think in response to that, I think one of the hardest things about this new old vision and our lives is that, and looking at God's Word a new way, is that we have the absolute tendency to take new principles and try to put them in old categories. And while some of us, I would absolutely agree that Bill's doing some of this, and every one of us have been doing this in one way, shape, or form, I think, in our lives. But we have not, as a church, embraced the entirety of it. Otherwise, we would be different. We would look different. We would be a different. The results would be different. And so I think one of the dangers in this, and as we move forward in this, keep this in mind, is that it's hard, it's almost impossible. I say it's hard. It's almost impossible to teach someone what they think they already know. And I was that guy. And so whenever I started learning new things, and God was challenging me on things, I kept going, oh yeah, I got that. Because, we are doing mission because we are doing service projects. And we are doing mission because we do support missionaries. And we are doing mission because I am preaching the gospel from the pulpit and all these different things. And the reality is that it was only a shadow of what God intended. And again, that's not anything about anybody specifically. It's just, I think that's kind of the tendencies we have, is to say, oh, I got this. If you came out of this last couple months saying, I got this, I would recommend that you spend some more time in prayer and consideration, because I don't think we have it. We have portions of it, we have visions of it, but we don't have the big picture of it necessarily yet. And certainly, as a congregation, I think that we have some way to go. And if that's the case, which I believe it is, that means the people, us, we have a ways to go as well. Anything else as far as, yes, Don?
The one thing with me is that I notice that just the little things that you can say to people, because normally I wouldn't say anything, but just have a nice day, or hey, you look nice, it's like, they're just taken by it, you know? And I come across more people, though, that they're nicer to you when you're nice to them. And I thought, how can I just say how you look nice and it would really make you feel good? That doesn't, that's nothing, that's simple. The world needs that, just a little bit of simple comments.
Just serving as a blessing in our everyday life is part of it, for sure. Absolutely. And I think the key, one of the phrases that I've really embraced over the last couple of weeks, probably a month or so, is this idea of sustainable integration. In other words, whatever we do here, it needs to be part of our lives and something we can continue on, as opposed to something we add on that is not sustainable. I think that's the difference between what we're doing now and what we've done before. Is that any other efforts we've had before, we've kind of said, we want you to go and do this now. And there is some element to this, except for basically I think the message is not, we want you to go do this now. It is, we want you to do what you're doing now, but do it differently. And we want you to, and certainly there's things we need to do more of and less of and that sort of thing. I don't want to underestimate or undersell the impact of this, what it takes to really put this in our lives. But I think when I get overwhelmed, I think, how am I going to get our people to do something? And the reality is you're already doing it as far as what you're supposed to be doing. You just need to take what you're doing and transform it for the glory of God and for the kingdom of God. And so we'll get more into that as we go along. So let's talk a little bit today. By the way, today is going to be offensive to some of you. Just going to put it out there right now. And I'll tell you, this is one of the, by the way, this is also going to be boring to some of you, perhaps. I'm a history nerd. I'm a nerd in that kind of way. I like the way to look at things from a historic perspective. And today's lesson is a lot about really how we got to where we are as a Western church, as a North American church. It's that idea of challenging the way we do things is absolutely biblical. And what I mean by that is that we have a building, we gather on a Sunday morning, and we do all these things. All these things that the churches are really identified for, where those things came from, where they originated from. It also is a historical example of when things started to go awry and how we got to the point where we are now, where we need a new old vision and why that's needed. And so we're going to jump right in. This is the past is now, living in a mission field. And so we look at page 45 in the little green box there, the rise and fall of Christendom. Now, Christendom is the term given to describe the religious culture that has dominated Western society since the 4th century, when the Roman Emperor Constantine made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. Post-Christendom refers to the time after Christendom, when the church lost its place of power and influence. The rise and fall of Christendom has created a unique set of issues for the church today. And so the question is, this is where I want you to kind of get into groups and just discuss this briefly. The first question then regarding Christendom is, what examples come to mind when you consider the influence of Christianity on American culture, past, present, and future? What are some examples that come to mind? So go ahead and get in a group of 6 or 8 or whatever and discuss this briefly. So what are some examples of Christendom, of the influence of Christianity on American culture? Just shout them out.
Education.
Education? Mm-hmm.
Universities and things like that were established. What you were saying, 105 out of 108 were all started as Christian universities.
Right, yes. Harvard and Yale included.
Fashion.
Fashion?
Fashion.
Okay.
Yeah, we were talking here, I was talking. Okay. Well, don't be so surprised, Elaine, you've seen me talk.
I will tell you, Trevor, we had this conversation with teenagers on Wednesday night, and that's one of the first things they said too.
Or fashion?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you think like a teenager, congratulations.
No, I'm just saying, you know, the early Christianity, I don't think that the early Christians decided first thing in the morning, at least by 8:30, let's get up and put on our best clothes.
Uh-huh.
Okay, and go someplace and parade around, especially on Christmas.
Right. So church clothes kind of thing, what you're speaking of.
Fashion.
Fashion,
Yeah.
yeah.
Now, I can tell that you are not a slave to fashion.
Not a slave, I'm a leader in fashion. I'm on the bleeding edge of fashion, let me tell you. Jeans and shirts, they're classic, anytime.
I'm trying to get there, man.
Well, another thing too, I think of Leave It to Beaver when I think of this. You know, kind of Christian values. I think of things that we're missing out on now that have been in my lifetime. You know, in my lifetime there was no church events or no school events on Sunday morning, no sports events on Sunday morning, Wednesday night, and now I remember the first time it was in Toledo, Oklahoma, where we had a girl that was on a traveling basketball team, I think it was, and they had a ball game tournament at 9 o'clock on a Sunday morning. You know, it was just, that's different. I think there's a lot of examples as far as the influence of Christianity. And again, I think unfortunately, a lot of times those two things have melded together in our minds, and we have this idea that American and Christian is the same thing in a lot of ways. And I don't think that is a healthy way to look at things, particularly now whenever Christendom is on its deathbed, so to speak. The second question then, and I just already gave the answer away. Way to go, Chris. Okay. But the question is, what examples might illustrate the diminishing influence of Christianity on American culture today? So go ahead and talk about that briefly.
Female basketball.
This isn't a very tough question, so we'll jump right into it. Share some examples. What are some examples? Colin.
We used to have the blue law.
Blue law, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Music and movies.
Music and movies. I think as a minister, in my lifetime, in my ministry career, which has been 18 years, when I started out, whatever I said was taken as truth and held in respect. Somewhere along the way, everything I said was challenged or questioned, but even by youth. You know, I think in that, I think preachers used to get free season tickets to the school ball games, and they get discounts at restaurants and things like that, and now they get dirty looks, especially when you ask for discounts. But what other examples of diminishing influence? I think Ellen's example was good, that people don't, they don't care about church. You know, it used to be that people were looking for a good church, or if they weren't looking immediately, that was kind of like, whenever I get settled down with the family, then I'll go back to church, or at some point. It was always kind of, but it's not the case anymore. People just don't care about church. Yes, ma'am, Barbara.
Well, you brought up the subject of Leeds to Beaver, and that show would not go over well with that. I mean, they still play it, but it's not on prime time.
Right.
Now the prime time shows are very exclusive.
Mhm.
The things you can see, learn on TV.
Yeah. And the reality is that we don't live in a Christendom, Christianity-centered, church-centered. I would argue, by the way, historically, we've never lived in a Christ-centered culture in America. We may have had some values of Christianity that were up on TV, and we had some laws that were kind of in our favor as a church, but I don't think that has ever. I don't think the blue laws or the church's prevalence in society ever really brought anybody to Jesus, if that makes
That was
sense.
good unless you need your pantyhose on Sunday morning.
If you need pantyhose on Sunday morning to go to church, you were in trouble. It caused many women to skip church because they had runs in their nose. Okay. We'll take a look at page 46. I want to read this little section here about Jeremiah 29, verses 1 through 9, because I think it's so important. And then I'm going to have you read Jeremiah 29 in your groups. But you see here it says on page 46, when thinking about the decline of Christendom from a biblical perspective, many people turn to the metaphor of exile. It's popular to think about the post-Christendom church living as exiles, similar to the nation of Israel when taken to Babylonian captivity in 586 BC. I've heard this preached. I've preached it probably before. It's this idea that we are, we use the verse, we are citizens of heaven, and we act like we're alien. We use the verses to talk about being aliens in a foreign land, and we talk about being exiles. And it continues on here. There's certainly parallels between the contemporary Christian experience of displacement, uncertainty, and irrelevance, and the struggles of the Jews in Babylon. However, this may not be the best metaphor. The idea of exile presupposes a desire to be restored to a previous way of life. The exiled Jews hoped for a time when their lost kingdom would be reestablished. When applied to the church in the post-Christendom era, it may lead some to place their hope in the return of Christendom. This is not what the church, or the world for that matter, needs today. And so I think the point of this being is that, yeah, we long for the good old days, perhaps, when we could turn on the TV and let the kids watch whatever was on TV, or we long for the good old days of this, that, and the other. And so that's why you see so many Christians, I think, fighting different laws in this country and standing up and doing that sort of thing, because they want to go back to that. I think that the point, though, and we'll see this as we go on here, that that's not what's best for the church or the kingdom or this country even. Because one way it was said, I think at one time, was that people in Christendom and people in our culture, a lot of them have just enough Jesus to inoculate them. And what I mean by that is that they come in contact with just enough Jesus to think they have it taken care of. They can check that off their list. And I think that was the case in Christendom. Continue on there. So instead, the church we better serve by looking at the words of Jeremiah, the prophet who spoke during the time of Babylonian exile. Jeremiah challenged the Jews who had been taken into exile to withstand the desire to return to a restored Israel. He urged them to accept their new situation as the will of God and to seek God's blessing for those they perceive as their enemies. Jeremiah called on them to seek the welfare of the city where God had sent them into exile. While the church today may feel a sense of exile brought to a place of uncertainty and unfamiliarity, let us not desire to return to a time of Christendom. God is not calling us to return to things of old, but to participate in something completely new. So what I want you to do, and here's the first question that you're going to read after that and discuss in your groups, I got that wrong, sorry. There's an example of, the question is, what do you think of when you hear the word exile, and what do you think about its use as a metaphor for the church today? And then talk about how the words of Jeremiah change the way you think about being exiled. That's questions 1 and 2 on page 46. So if someone in your group, get the Bible out and read Jeremiah chapter 29, 1 through 9, and then discuss those two questions. I'm going to give you about 5 or 10 minutes to do that, so go ahead and discuss that.
Like 2 generations.
And these Jews were, I mean, it's to marry, you don't say to marry Babylonians.
For crime.
Exile to an area is not a positive thing.
Yeah, it's marriage.
yeah, into our buildings and doing, we haven't been out in a lot of places, like,
Okay, I think I love this passage and its application as a parallel to what we as a church, the new Israel are today, and the instructions that are given there, and how I think they also apply to us as an example of how we have to engage the world around us and to kind of view the world around us. There's three verses or 4 verses I want to point out to you that I think are important to see as far as our attitudes towards the world around us. First thing is that he said, build houses and settle down, plant gardens and eat what they produce. And so in that instance, he was saying, just hang out. Just be there. Be in the city. Be where you are. Don't run away. Stick to where you are. Hang out. Do life. Build houses. You don't build a house and settle down and plant gardens if you don't plan on being there a while. And so, be present in that world and do, don't run away. That was the first thing in verse 5. And then he said in verse 7, seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. And I think the key here is don't battle. It didn't say go to war with the heathens around you, or stand up and fight the ungodliness around you, or whatever the case may be. But seek the peace and prosperity of the city. That those people around you, seek peace for them, prosperity for them. I think a lot of times not us, but churches in North America now, they stand up against the things in the city, and they protest, and they don't want the prosperity. They want they want the city and the world around us to be brought to our knees, so then we can turn to God. That's kind of the attitude that's been. But in Jeremiah, he said, seek the peace and prosperity. Want what's good, and not only that, but there's an element of participating in that, to redeem the city around you, to give peace and prosperity in the city. A great example of that is, you go back to Daniel, the book of Daniel. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and the whole story there. Daniel was a faithful believer of God, and yet he advanced in that foreign pagan government to a high position. And the two are not mutually exclusive. And Daniel didn't fight, and the others didn't fight every little thing that was contrary to God's will. They only fought when it really became necessary to do so. And so I think this idea of not battling is important. But, so we have two things here. Stay put, do life in the city, make sure you look for peace and prosperity, promote peace and prosperity in your city. But then there's the warning that goes along with that in verse 8 and 9. Yes, this is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel says. Do not let the prophets and diviners among you deceive you. Do not listen to the dreams that you encourage them to. Don't listen to the dreams you encourage them to have. They are prophesying lies to you in my name. I have not sent them, declares the Lord. And so the idea there being is that, okay, I want you to be in the city. I want you to seek the peace and prosperity of the city, but be careful. I want you to be in the city, but not of the city. That sounds kind of familiar, right? I want you to be in the world, but not of the world. It reminds me of Matthew chapter 10, where Jesus said, be innocent, shrewd as snakes and innocent as doves when you're going out among the people. He was talking in that instance to his disciples, but I think it applies to us as well. That we are to be shrewd, to know how to go into the world and to share the gospel. And at the same time, we have to be innocent as doves. Go to the book of Jude, where he said, gives three different kinds of people to save. People who are basically pagans, people who are wavering, and people who are in the faith but have backslidden, as it were. And then he says, but be careful to hate even the clothing stained by corrupt flesh. In other words, do these things, come in contact with these people, be with them, do life with them, have relationships with them, but understand that you're not to become one of them. They're to become one of you. And I think there's a dichotomy there that we need to keep in mind, that we are to be in the world, but not of the world, to seek the peace and the prosperity of a city who may not completely and probably will not ever agree with our values or our what's important to us, but yet that's God's will for us as we move forward. So that, the difference in that is, I think a lot of times we want to fight. We think that the way to get back is to say, let's legislate morality, let's have the laws look like the Bible, and let's do this, that, and the other, and declare that we are a Christian nation or have been a Christian nation, and all that. And whether or not that's true is a whole other discussion, but where we're at right now is very similar to where they were in Babylon. And I think that those are the principles that we should keep in mind. Look at page 47. I love this. We're not in Kansas anymore. And I think that, there's nothing more clear to me than that. And again, I've been in ministry 18 years, and the seismic shift that's taken place in the 18 years that I've been in ministry is just amazing. And you've seen it as well. And so what is our response? That's the whole point of this, is that how did we get here, first of all? And that's what we're going to talk about on page 47. Look at Christendom to post-Christendom. The second paragraph under that, it says, in 313 AD, the Roman Emperor Constantine adopted the Christian faith as his own and decided to replace paganism with Christianity as the official imperial religion. He invited the church to come in from the margins of society where it had been operating for the previous 3 centuries and join him in Christianizing the empire. Giving great resources and favors to the church, Constantine set in motion a process that would eventually bring all of Europe into a church-state relationship known as Christendom. It's difficult to overstate the impact Constantine's decision had on the Christian faith. A few of the changes that took place included the assumption that all citizens were Christian by birth, infant baptism as a symbol for necessary incorporation into Christian society, Sunday as the required day of church attendance with penalties for non-compliance, the definition of orthodoxy as the common belief shared by all, which was determined by powerful church leaders supported by the state, the construction of massive and ornate church buildings, a strong distinction between clergy and laity, the relegation of the laity to a largely passive role. You go to church and listen. The increased wealth of the church and obligation of the required tithes to fund the system, the division of the globe into either Christendom or heathendom, and the waging of war in the name of Christ and the church, and the use of political and military force to impose the Christian faith. Now, here's the problem with this, and I'll be really honest with you. I think in all the history of mankind, Constantine's so-called conversion is the biggest attempt, or biggest victory by Satan. I really believe that to be the case. That from that point forward, you take a look at the previous 3 centuries and see how the church was growing exponentially on the fringes of society, not at the center, at the fringes. And then all of a sudden, here's how it happened, by the way, in case you didn't know. Constantine was going into battle. He looked up and he saw a cloud that looked like a cross. Actually, it meant a cloud, but he saw a vision of a cross in the sky and said, okay, God, if I win this battle, I'll become a Christian. And he won, and he slaughtered his enemies, and he said, okay. And so that's how Christianity became the imperial religion at that point. I don't know Constantine. He's a little before my time. I don't know his heart. Maybe he did accept Christ truly and fully. I have my doubts because I think, again, that this is a tool of Satan to thwart the way the church was. Because before then, it was a movement. And it was on the margins, and it was growing like it never had before. And if you take a look at the growth of Christianity, if you take a look in graph form, it was kind of like this. You've got time, and you've got amount of people. Okay, so this is years, and this is growth. And this is how it started. We had the cross where Jesus died and rose again, and we have Acts chapter 2, and it went like this. Like this, and then it kind of gets in right about there, and right here is Christendom. And what has happened then, if you look in comparison to the amount of population growth over the last 1,700 years or so, it has really, I mean, the decline of Christianity has been like this. Now, it hasn't declined numerically. Let me do another kind of example here. Here you have population. Okay, this is population over time. And as it grew like this, as the population has grown, then at first it was like this. Christianity was like this. And then Christendom comes in and it levels off. And it's much less with population and growth as far as that's concerned. And so the point being is that something changed. Something major changed. And these examples that we talked about, that we just read about, those were some of the major things that changed about Christianity. And you talk about everybody was Christian by association. Everybody went to church by law. Everybody gave to the church. The church became the place where things happened. And so then you look at page 47, the bottom paragraph. It says, the net effect of Christendom over the centuries is that Christianity moved from being a dynamic, revolutionary, social, and spiritual movement to being a static religious institution, with its corresponding structures, priesthood, and rituals. The Christian faith moved from being an integrated way of life that was lived out 7 days a week to being an obligation that was fulfilled by attending a service at a set time. Here's the bottom line, folks. The structure of our church as we know it has been more influenced by Christendom than it has been by Scripture. You know, a professional preacher getting up and preaching, I'm not saying fire him, by the way, but a professional preacher that gets up and speaks, an audience that listens, a set time once or twice a week, schedules that are set by the church, basically, the buildings, the central gathering like that, all of that stuff resembles more of 325 AD than it does right after church, Acts chapter 2. And so, and by the way, that doesn't mean that some of the stuff that we're doing is wrong or sinful. I think it's just important to know where those things came from and the way we do things, where they came from. And so that's very important. Now, here's why that's happened. Let me give you and here's the words are Christology, which is Jesus. What we believe about Jesus. Oops, I should have done that. Sorry, I'm still getting used to this fancy thing. Christ, and then the word is Christology, which is basically what we believe about Christ. And then you have missiology, or purpose, our mission. If you spell it right. And then you have ecclesiology, which is form of church, what the church looks like, and the form and function. Now, whenever Jesus ascended, and we have Acts chapter 2, what people believed in the early church about Jesus informed their purpose, which informed the function of the church. So Christology informed missiology, which then informed ecclesiology. The simple way of putting that is that they knew what they believed about Jesus. They knew about Jesus. They had followed the life and teachings of Jesus. And that told them what their purpose was as a church. Okay, with me so far? So they believed in Jesus. They knew what they believed about Jesus. That influenced their purpose as a church. And then out of that, just naturally, they knew what to do as far as ecclesiology is concerned, as far as the form and function of the church. And you see that in Acts chapter 2. They met from house to house in the temple courts. They broke bread with one another, and they spread, all that thing, all those characteristics were informed by their mission, which was informed by what they believed about Jesus. That seems like a pretty nice, natural way to do it. And so that's how the early church started out. By the way, there's a book that came out. It was in conjunction with a North American Christian convention called Unleashed. That was the theme. And a bunch of ministers, Christian church, a couple of Church of Christ ministers wrote this book. And I want to read some quotes from that because they talk exactly about this thing. And here's the first thing they said, is that in the early church, Christology, what we believe about Jesus, determined missiology, what we believe about the church's mission, which in turn determined ecclesiology, which is how the church must function. And since Jesus was all about proclaiming his good news so that people could be saved, Luke chapter 19, verse 10, the mission of the followers of Jesus must be to proclaim the good news so that people can be saved. Makes sense, right? And therefore, the primary function of the church should be to seek and save the lost. And that we see that lived out and played out in the early church. That's just the way it was. That's the way it looked. And that's why there was explosive growth. That's why it was multiplication as opposed to addition when it came to church growth. That's why it was a movement rather than an institution. And all those things came into being. But after that, again, something happened. It was Christendom, but here's what happened. What did the church do with its newfound good fortune when Constantine made it the state religion? It built cathedrals. Massive, beautiful edifices where people could come to experience God, receive religious services, and learn about Jesus. So they went from the margin society with no church building per se, they met in homes and things like that. They said, sweet, we're the state religion now. We got some clout. We got some power. Let's build a building. And if we're going to build a building for God, let's make it fancy. And that seems to make sense, right? And if you know, go Google, European cathedrals and see how beautiful they are. They are truly beautiful buildings. And that was kind of the focus of the church then in the early times. They built cathedrals, and that's where people would come to experience God. No longer, by the way, we didn't have to meet in homes anymore. Why would we do that? We have this fancy, nice building. There's no need to meet in a home. We just come here and look, we got stained glass and tall, steeples and all this kind of stuff. So why would you want to meet in your home when you could come to this beautiful building? And so people would come there, they would receive religious services. That's where baptisms and communion would take place. And then, of course, they would be taught about Jesus by the professional now, for the first time, professional ministers. They would study the Bible and preach and teach in that way. So that's what happened. And then, after that, then, since AD 325, one of the primary initiatives of the church has been to put up buildings so that people will come. By believing that buildings are central to the church, it's possible that the mission of the church can become all about putting up larger and better buildings, which will in turn direct, even by default, what is taught about Jesus. And the point here being, by the way, before I got here, and even when I got here, the thought of building a new building was exciting. That meant success for a minister. If you were a minister that had been through a building program, that means you were a good minister because you increased attendance enough where you had to have a bigger building. And if the church was, we'd always had that if we build it, they will come kind of mentality. And I've even heard church growth people say, if you can build a new building, do it, because it builds excitement in the community. They want to know what's going on in your church. And so building buildings has been a focus since that time, even until now. And so, but the point there is that what your focus is will then, in turn, what is taught about Jesus and what is taught about how you engage the world for Jesus. And so what has happened then is that essentially, instead of this being the way it is, where our thoughts of Christ had influenced our purpose, which had influenced our church, through Christendom, the opposite became true. That what we believed about church, we then allowed that to influence our mission, which then subsequently, in some ways, affected what we believe about Jesus. I think of a conversation I had with Tom McLeod one time, and we were lamenting the fact that as a church in general, not just this church, but as a church in general, we have reduced Jesus to something he never really was. That we made Jesus about somebody that was against stuff. Again, saying that the church was, this is what we can't do. And the funny thing is that most of the stuff the church has said we can't do, Jesus did. He hung out with sinners. He was called a drunkard, and I think that's because he had a drink occasionally. I think that he was, he was out there in the world, and some of the things that we said we can't do, Jesus was known for in his time. And so we've forgotten that part about Jesus, and we've neglected that, and we've allowed the come here isolationist mentality to separate us from who Jesus really is. And again, because we have our buildings, our beautiful buildings, our facilities, and we've said we need to design our programs and such, our mission, this here, because of our buildings and because of our resources, and we need to get people to come here. We need to invite them to church. We need to get them to be a part of our activities here. And so, by and large, over the last century, and really, it started back in 300 AD, everything we've done has been focused, not everything, but the wide majority of things that we've done have been focused on getting people to the church campus or to a church event somewhere, even if it's not a church campus. It could be anywhere. So that's kind of how it's changed and how things have looked. And so ecclesiology has then informed our missiology, which has changed our Christology, what we believe about Jesus. So what's happened then, there are three major areas where this is affected, where this made impact. First of all, money became an issue. I don't think there was ever an issue about money in the early church in the way that we think of it now. There were no light bills to pay, there were no ministers to pay. In fact, what we see in money is we see Paul talking about, I think it's 1 Corinthians 8 and 9, where the people gave beyond their ability. And they gave beyond their ability. Their generosity was towards one another. They took up offerings so they could help the poor and help one another. And so that was that. But money, they said to unleash. Building cathedrals cost a lot of money. The mission of the church became keeping the financial engine of the church running. And what was taught about Jesus was driven by the church's need to pay its bills. And, we're still, I think we're guilty of this to a certain extent. I will be honest with you. I am always nervous about my paycheck. The worldly side of me is. I'm nervous that because church giving, church budget, that is my paycheck. And so I've got to be very intentional about not letting that affect how I lead. And I think a lot of churches, a lot of ministers have allowed that to influence the way they lead. They lead safely so they won't lose that paycheck. Now, so by the way, I'm not really scared yet. Just kidding. But money has been a big issue. That's kind of affected how we do things. The second thing then is all of a sudden we have power. And when cathedrals were built and the church gained power in the community, the church began to flex its muscle in the political arena. Not only was morality legislated, but Christians began to believe that Christianity should be legislated as well. Historically, this meant that positions of leadership within the church, because of the political power they wielded, began to be bought and sold to the highest bidder. The hope of the world should have been Jesus through his followers, but that was replaced with the power of the church exercised through the government. Now, all you have to do is go step through a junior high or high school history class of European history to know this is true, right? The Catholic Church's mistakes and power and things of that nature. But I would recommend that it's not a Catholic issue, and it's not even an issue for medieval times. It's something that is that's one of the hard things that we've struggled with, is that we want to grasp for that power because we've had that power for so long. Uh-oh. Okay. But we've had that, we've grasped onto that, we've held on to that, and so it's back. Good. Okay. And so that the power was an issue. The next thing then that was an issue, or it has been an issue, has been the center of society. And when cathedrals became the largest buildings in the community, at the center of the community, it became a provider of services for the community. People came to market at the cathedral. Markets were typically set up around the church building. where they could also have their children baptized, demons exorcised, and sins exonerated. A one-stop shop. The Christian consumer mentality began to take shape. This, again, is one of the most damaging things for the church. This consumer mentality. And what we've done is we've catered to that so much as churches. And so we've said, oh, people want to be sold this, that, or the other. And so that's been our missiology. That's been how we've approached mission. We said we want to have, people want a contemporary worship service, or they want a good youth ministry, or they want a dynamic preacher, or they want whatever the case would be, fill in the blank. And that's we've kind of advertised those things. We've kind of put those out there and said, just have them taste that, have people experience that, and that'll appeal to them. But the problem is, as I've said before, is that what you win them with is what you will win them to. And so what that means is that the reason people come to church is going to be the reason they stay there. And so, for example, have you ever heard of people or been in a church where people were there because of the preacher? That they came and they liked the preacher, they liked his leadership, and then if the preacher left, it seems every church I've been to, if a preacher leaves, somebody leaves with him. And I know the last church, whenever I had a minister leave, we lost a significant chunk of people who were there because they liked the preacher. If you're there because of the worship style, well, if you change the worship style, guess what happens? They're going to go find that worship style somewhere else. And that's a consumer mentality. And it all started when the church became the center of society. Now, this idea, it seemed to work for a while. This idea of the church being the center of society. But no longer is that the case. And we look on page 48, and it gives a diagram of really what it looks like nowadays. Let's see if I can get it to change here. It's kind of... Oh, it timed out. Let's try it again. There we go. This is a picture on page 48. That pre-Christendom, before Constantine, you had Rome was the center of society, and the church was on the margins. The dominant seat of culture was Rome. Then in AD 313 Christendom, the church became the dominant seat of society. And so that's how things changed. And then the mid-20th century, you can't really pinpoint it, but you have this pluralistic postmodern culture that has become the center of society. That no longer has church hold its place of influence. That was it. And so no longer does church hold its place of influence. And so I love what Reggie McNeil said. He said, I think it says there in the book there, the paragraph underneath that it's 30 AD all over again. That really, we talk about our new old vision and going back to the way Jesus did it and the way the early church did it. There's no better time, because I don't think there's probably any time in history where we are more like the first century than we are right now. No other time that we are more like the first 3 centuries than we are right now, where the church is on the margins, and we have an opportunity to become like the early church once again, to become exponential in our growth, in our mission, and to be out and among people and make a real difference, as opposed to what has been done through Christendom. Comments or questions so far? By the way, that puts our ologies back in order. It helps us put, when church is no longer the center of the world, then it puts Christ back at the center where it needs to be. So Christology will then influence missiology, which will then influence ecclesiology. So we got to go back to what we believe about Jesus, so that'll inform how we bring people to Christ. And then I'm not too worried about what a church looks like, because I think if we get those first 2 things right, the rest of it will take care of itself. So comments, questions, thoughts, rude gestures?
To me, it does drive you back to the scriptures, because who was Jesus then, and what was he doing? How does that affect us? It's a lot more than just trying to figure out all the rules and stuff. Now it's like, this is a lot more personal. This is a lot more life-changing. This is a lot more what's going on inside of me, as opposed to just what do I do every Sunday or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. What else? Yeah, Bill.
I think in this whole thing, this is the best point that you brought up about this Council of Nicaea. And it wasn't just Christian leaders, he also brought pagan leaders there too. I mean, that's where we get Good Friday and Easter from,
Mhm.
and not Passover in the first fruits. And but the key to all this, I think, if you look at the growth of Christianity in the Gentile world, was the Apostle Paul. And I mean, they were as pagan and as idolatrous, they had no idea. And what he did, I mean, changed the whole world
Mhm.
for Christ. I mean, you look at the apostles, really, they went to the Jews and Jews only. They didn't have a ministry biblically to Gentiles. It was the Apostle Paul. And I think those doctrines he laid down from Romans to Philemon is the key to bring in. Because most Christians today, and I mean, you ask them, they say, they believe that their salvation is based on what they do or do not do.
Mhm.
And they present themselves to God for God's approval. But Paul completely turns that upside down. He said, no, it's what Jesus did on the cross, the basis of your salvation. And it's not in you.
Mhm.
The church has done a horrible job of presenting that message to the world. I mean, a terrible job.
I think the key to that is that this idea of churchianity, because I think for the last, well, since the beginning of this Christendom era, that we've converted people to the church more than we've converted people to Christ.
Exactly.
And
You know,
so,
you follow these sacraments or you do these 5 things wrong, but it all gets down to salvation is based on what you do and do not do. And
Right.
that's not Christianity. That's not the message that Paul gave to that Gentile world. And
Right.
that's the key to this whole thing.
and back up to the first part of the discipleship, the New Old Vision, you know, we talked about how we've made discipleship into discipleship by association instead of discipleship by identity. And I think that is so key there, is that when you get away from the church, and again, what we've said here, this is not a church growth vision series. You know, I hope that we grow, because if we do this right, then people will come to Jesus. And people, by the way, people will come to Jesus that didn't know Jesus before, which is something we've not been very good at. I don't care if you bring 50 people to Christ through this New Old Vision and not one of them comes to this church, great. Praise the Lord. Well, we will stand and pray and praise that and celebrate that as much here as we would if they were all baptized in our building and sitting in our pews or our chairs. So yeah, I think it's a great point, and that you take a look at those things, and it's not about the church, and that's why I think it was Shannon that had gotten upset with me. And I think I mentioned this a while back, that I told her, stop inviting people to church. And of course I don't mean that specifically, but stop letting that be our first method and mode of getting people to Jesus. That, like we talked about with Ellen, if Ellen invited any of those people to church, that would have shut them down and ruined it for her forever. And so it's not about getting people to church. It's not about Christendom in this way. It's about Jesus. It's about discipleship. It's about all those things that we've been talking about, and keeping that going. And again, letting Christology, letting what we believe about Jesus, influence what we do as a church for purpose, and letting the rest of it take care of itself. Any other thoughts on that? Yes, ma'am.
I just think that now, and I'm thinking that it might be worse now for us than it was back then, because everybody has a strong impression already. They've already got this image of what we are and what we believe and what we're against, and has that undo a lot of that.
Yes.
Back to what the real message is. It's all from it, and you're saying that, I don't think it would have to undo understanding.
Yes, that's a great point. What she said there, I think, is so key. And I read this also in an article not too long ago, where we do live in a basically a society that's very similar, if not identical, to the first century, the first 3 centuries, but we have a disadvantage because we have 1,700 years of, for the lack of a better term, church screw-ups. And we have to undo that in the people that aren't interested in church. There is a legitimate reason why people aren't interested in church. Now, that doesn't mean, by the way, that they're right about church. You know, they may have preconceived notions, and those may be completely wrong, particularly about our congregation. But we have to undo those, and the only way we can undo those is to show people that Christians are not jerks, that Christians are not hypocrites, or if they are, we do it with grace, and we press on, and we try to do it, we try to live for the glory of God. And the only way we can do any of that is if we have relationships with them in a way, and let them see that both in our church activity and in our own lives as well, to where they can come in contact with a real person that is a believer of Jesus who is not perfect, but is living for the glory of God. And so, yeah, absolutely right, Ellen, that we are in a worse position in the post-Christendom society than they were in pre-Christendom, because there was no negatives, probably there may have been some negatives, but for the most part, there was no mess-ups by the church. They were actually known for love, exceptional love. If you read the historical documents, that when there were famines and there were plagues, they would stick around at the risk of their own lives, and oftentimes at their own sacrifice of their own lives, to help others, to love others, and they loved each other. And there's a lot of secular historical evidence for that to show that they had a positive outlook, or the culture around them had a positive outlook of the church. Any other thoughts on that? Now, I think just to kind of close up, you look at page 49, 48 and 49. The bottom of the page says, here's the important point in this whole discussion. The difficulty the church is experiencing today of relating to the current culture is in large part due to our Christendom heritage. Many in the church today still believe that Christianity is in a place of influence and significance. Many still operate under the false assumption that Christendom is alive and well. While there may be some parts of the country that still cling to Christian values, the vast majority of the population is rapidly moving away from the things associated with the church. In the eyes of many outside the church has become completely irrelevant. And then the last paragraph, it's maybe a hard pill to swallow for many, but the reality is that the United States is not a Christian nation. And the sooner we can come to grips with that reality, the sooner we can return to the revolutionary missional movement that is exemplified for us in the early church. We must see that it really is 30 AD all over again. The reality is that we're always going to have, again, going back to our cultural distance, we're always going to have the M1s and M2s who kind of sort of live by that Christendom mindset. But the reality is that the culture has shifted from M1s and M2s to 3s, 4s, and 5s. That most people, particularly if people don't know Jesus, most of those people think that the church is irrelevant to their lives, if nothing else. And so Christendom is not in place, and we cannot expect to build a better church and be successful in this culture. It's a cultural paradigm shift that we have to compensate for. And by the way, it's like Tolly said, we got to go back to Scripture, because there is nothing in the Bible that tells me how we should bring the church back to the center of society and power, and how to get the laws changed to godly laws, or to have Christian institutions put into national habits. But there is a lot of Scripture on how to make disciples, and how to spread the word, and how to be the church in the way that God intended. So we've got to rely on what we know, and what we know is what God has provided and revealed to us in Scripture. Okay? Any other thoughts or questions as we kind of close up today? I hope for those of you that aren't nerdy like me, I hope it didn't bore you too much. I hope it kind of gives you a picture again. I love to see that the reason it's hard, the new old visions like this are tough, and a change in the church is tough, is not because it's just something we've done for our generation. This is the stuff that's been in place and been done since 300 AD, really. That's where it really was set into motion. And so it's very easy for things that have been involved or put into place for that long for us to elevate those things to biblical status when they couldn't be anything further from the truth. So I hope you see some clarity in that. All right? Thank you for being here. You got about 20 minutes before church starts, or before worship assembly starts. Church doesn't start, by the way. We are the church, right?